This is Talk of New England. With Barbara Anderson and Jim Braude on New England Cable News.
Welcome to the Talk of New England. I'm Barbara Anderson.
And I'm Jim Braude.
This week we'll look at the final question on the ballot in Massachusetts. The final question is question 4, a proposed tax on certain oils and hazardous materials. Monies raised would be placed into the State Environmental Challenge Fund, or at least that's what this is all supposed to be about.
I should say to you, by the way, that we tried some revolutionary approach to doing question 3 last week. I don't know if we're going to repeat it. It was this new approach to television. Do you recall when both the 2 hosts and the 2 guests all talk simultaneously? It was quite a new kind of thing.
That's right, so someone out there can always relate to one of us.
I think that's probably right. We're not going to do it that way this week. We've decided to go back to traditional broadcasting. We're going to look at question 4 both as an environmental measure and in a broader context, how such moves affect the economy and jobs. And that really is this week's overarching topic, the ones that voters say they're most concerned about, not just in Massachusetts, but across the nation, jobs.
The human condition is essentially a balancing act between jobs and other concerns like the environment, health, the spotted owl, internal combustion engines, and all the things that are actually part of this year's discussion during the presidential campaign as well.
So, but the notion of balance is, and I don't know if you've gotten to that point yet, Barbara, is balance means there's got to be something on one side and something on another. There's got to be a position that, yes, if we've got to do safety in the workplace, you can only go so far, but you can't say there should be no governmental involvement in safety in the workplace, no governmental involvement in environmental protection. Where is the appropriate place for this balance to be struck? It's a very, very difficult
thing. The other question when it gets really ridiculous is the concept of jobs for people who grow tobacco. And yet it's been pretty much proven that tobacco is a killer. And yet, so how far do you go to allow tobacco growing to continue, not to mention subsidizing with our tax dollars, while still worrying about the jobs of the people who grow tobacco? And then, of course, you can carry that to its logical absurdity, which is, well, what about people who grow heroin or whatever? You don't grow heroin.
Whatever you do to it.
Whatever you do to it, poppies or whatever.
You grow those things.
Yes.
But let me tell you, one of the problems, I think, is that a lot of people who talk about the jobs issue, when you think about things like environmental protection or health care, are using it purely as a cover when, in fact, they don't believe in environmental protection or government involvement. They don't believe that government should have a role in making sure workers are safe on the job, that sort of thing. I mean, one of the hot debates, what was it, Quayle called Gore an environmental extremist. The following couple of days later, we saw the 3 presidential candidates talking about this whole issue of fuel efficiency and what's the appropriate level. The notion that Bush at least was talking about was if we reach the fuel efficiency standards that people like Bill Clinton and lots of others are talking about, which means less pollution, cleaner air, all those sort of things, it's going to mean the jobs of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of auto workers.
But then, of course, you have to start thinking about consumers and what they want. The fact is you can now get fuel efficiency of over 50 miles a gallon if you want to drive around in this little car and don't want to take your family with you. But since we do want sometimes to choose a larger car because we feel safer in them, because if we crash into another automobile or a tree or a stone wall, we're safer in a large, non-fuel efficient automobile. These are things that consumers make a decision.
How safe do you want to be? Do you want them to be safe enough that they can be forced to wear seatbelts in their car?
Who is them?
The consumer. How do you feel about government requiring, which they used to do in Massachusetts, people being forced to buckle up in their car, which is proven to reduce deaths and serious injury? Is that a good idea?
I think people should definitely buckle up in their cars.
Should they be forced to buckle up?
I don't like the use of the word force. I think people should be intelligent enough to make the decisions for themselves.
Should government allow
as they are in automobile decision making. I mean, I personally, while I realize a large car is safer, I drive a small car. I prefer the fuel efficiency myself, even though I would love to have one of those Range Riders, you know, with the big wheels. And,
well, this gets back to balancing that. It's your personal choice.
That's right. My personal choice, and the government should leave me alone.
Well, does government leave you alone, meaning government should never be involved in fuel efficiency questions? They should, if cars are to be produced with 3 miles a gallon, if people want to buy them, they should be allowed to buy them?
The reason we have a fuel efficiency debate is because back in the 60s, people like me were buying Volkswagens while Detroit was producing, and the unions were encouraging the production of, and certainly the automobile industry was encouraging the production of these big gas guzzlers. Those of us who cared about fuel efficiency and cars we could afford were buying the little Volkswagen. Because of this competition from a foreign country, I know that's a bad thing to some presidential candidates or vice presidential candidates, but because of that competition, the American automobile industry had to start making compact cars to compete with the German Volkswagen.
Let's assume a lot of people
I made a decision, and because of my personal decision, not the government deciding that it was not going to require something, you had a revolution in the American automobile industry.
I had a big clunker, but I actually don't want to talk about that. But I don't know where you're going, Barbara. Are you basically saying if people are willing to spend the money and buy huge gas-guzzling cars, those 20-foot long jobs, if they're willing to do it, the government should not be allowed to be involved in saying how many miles a gallon you got to be able to get?
Are you saying somebody who has 8 kids and wants them safe inside a huge gas-guzzling car shouldn't be allowed to put their entire family inside a safe vehicle? If that is their choice, if their value is, it's more important to them to have a big, safe car than it is to have the concern of the environment, shouldn't they be able to make that decision in a free country, or are you generally opposed to free countries?
Well, I'm not opposed to government having some involvement. I think it's very important that government make sure we have decent air we can breathe in places like Los Angeles and other communities where you cough more than you breathe cleanly. And so the notion is, getting back to what you said a few minutes ago, balancing act, you really don't believe in a balancing act, which I think you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, stay out of fuel efficiency
No,
government,
that's not what I'm
stay out of health care, stay out of every single issue, let the free market allegedly...
There is a balancing act. Environmentalists care enough about the environment to get smaller cars and worry less about the safety of the automobile.
I'm talking about government in the balance. Tell me one thing, like environmental protection.
You're always talking about government. That's all you care about is government.
That's what these balancing act questions are about. Tell me one thing that government should be able to do that you'd support. No, that is not what balancing acts are about.
What does it mean? Balancing acts are about consumers making intelligent, informed decisions.
230 million individual balancing acts.
There's a downside to everything. That's called the free market, Jim.
Because that's what you believe in.
Because
it's worked so well over the last couple of years.
There's always a decision. It's worked since the beginning of this country. That's what this country is all about, is individual decision-making, a free market, people trying to determine what is best for them without the government and people like you trying to tell us what's best for us.
Let's talk about people like me.
That's the whole thing.
If that's such a great idea, and it's been practiced by George Bush, and he uses the words again, why do 77% of the people think that George Bush is doing a rotten job with the economy, and 91% of the people think we're going in the wrong direction with George Bush's view of the economy? He believes in the free market, North American Free Trade Agreement,
that's the debatable
all these kinds of things.
Do you have evidence that George Bush believes in the free market?
He says so.
This is not a stab at George Bush. We're just discussing only on this narrow issue here. I don't have any proof that anybody who's really up there on the top in government believes in the free market. I haven't seen any indication that our political leaders even know there is a free market, never mind believe in it. And that's why George Bush is in trouble, because he hasn't gone out there and defended the free market the way Ronald Reagan did, and he's left it to people like Al Gore, who doesn't even believe in the internal combustion engine.
So do you believe, put aside George Bush, do you believe in a totally free market? Or basically you're saying there's no role whatsoever for government in issues like, let's stay with environmental protection since we're going to talk about it tonight. Is there any appropriate role for government? Can they require anything? Should they be able to pass regulations? Should they be able to require anything of companies or individuals, or should it just be, to hell with it, people can do whatever they want? What's your view?
Well, obviously, they can control the safety factors. They can say if something isn't safe enough, but when the issue is it a safe car, is an environmentally sound car?
What does it mean, control safety factors? What are they allowed to do?
They can't make that decision.
Can they say that unsafe cars can't be produced?
No, I don't see anything wrong, for instance, with automobile inspections to make sure that the car you're driving is safe.
So if you think that's okay,
I've never heard anybody object to that.
Why shouldn't the government also be able to say, well, listen, you're coughing too many fumes out. It's going to cause my children and my family not to be able to breathe well in my community, so there should be environmental protection standards as well. How do you draw the line?
Up to a point, yes.
What's that point?
But the point where consumers themselves are complaining that they aren't being given enough choices. I mean, you've cleaned up the air somewhat in Los Angeles, but because of the smaller vehicles, you probably have increased the size of deaths on the road in Los Angeles. If that
cleaned up the air in Los Angeles because Daryl Gates is no longer there, Barbara.
Everything is a trade-off. Everything in life. And that's what you liberals don't understand.
Well, everything is a trade-off.
Choices have to be made. Government is not the best entity to making those choices.
What's interesting, it also happens to be the hot issue in every single presidential debate, every vice presidential debate. If you talk about environmental protection, the end of the sentence has to be, how does it affect jobs? Talk about health care, how does it affect jobs? If you believe in raising taxes, whether it's on the rich, people in the middle, poor people, whoever, how does it affect jobs? And I think that's a healthy discussion,
something you don't discuss during the booming 80s, because people have jobs and they aren't worried about it. Now is a time when they are concerned about their jobs, and they're looking for the trade-offs, looking for a decision to be made between these two important items.
And as I said, in my judgment, people like you say the word jobs, not that you care that much about it, but frankly, Barbara, because you don't believe government has an appropriate role to play in any of these areas. Isn't that really the case?
I believe that the jobs are created by the private sector, all of them. All jobs are created by the private sector. There wouldn't be any jobs in the public sector if the private sector weren't creating the revenues for those jobs.
But you know that
this is what liberals like you don't care about.
But if we carried that to a logical extreme, Barbara, and we abolish government, that means your candidate, George Bush, couldn't be president of anything. There'd be no government for him to preside over in January when he was re-inaugurated.
That's all right with me.
George Bush, as I said last week, her candidate, and interestingly, Bill Clinton, at least from this morning's paper, seems to be dropping like a rock. Do you think it's because Barbara Anderson announced her support for George Bush last week?
Why is it my candidate, George Bush, but it isn't your candidate who's dropping like a rock? I mean, Bill Clinton's name just gets to sit out there all by
Because
itself.
I said it with
In
15
fact,
seconds
yes.
ago before the commercial break.
My reluctant candidate, or my candidate reluctantly, I should say, though I guess there's some evidence he's a reluctant candidate as well, is holding his own. Your candidate, Bill Clinton, is dropping like a rock, and Ross Perot, whom I considered voting for at least for a while there, is a rising star.
I thought you called him Rock Perot. We're going to be back in a couple of minutes. Stay with us to
Bill
talk
Clinton.
about question
Rock
4, what it
Clinton.
means for the economy, what it
Rock
means for the
light.
environment, and everything else. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the Talk of New England. I'm Barbara Anderson. This is Jim Braude.
I want to say before you ask the question, we just found out why Barbara supported that toxic waste reduction thing in 1986 on the ballot, because we figured out during the break that it didn't raise any money, didn't cost anything, so she was glad to clean it up as long as she didn't have to pay for it.
It was a
Is that
matter
fair?
of setting priorities, which of course we still have to do within our budget for this existing question, and getting back to
No,
our
I don't want to
theme.
get back. No, I wanted to say one more thing.
Well, at the time- at the end of the show, we will discuss this, Mr. Braude.
No, it's fair. You know why team was formed in
Well, to
1987?
get more of our money from
To get
this,
more of your
to
money.
raise
You know what?
taxes.
Team was formed because in
Make bigger government.
1986 on ballot questions, question 3, remember it in 1986?
Yes, absolutely.
Tax cap. 54% of the people said cap my taxes. That's fair, cap my state taxes. Seconds later, people voted 74% for question 4. It said, by the way, while you're capping my taxes, Barbara Anderson,
Right.
please spend a hell of a lot more money on hazardous waste
That's
cleanup,
exactly.
including Barbara Anderson.
And I voted yes on both of them.
So cap my taxes, but spend a lot more
See, this is what you don't
money.
understand. We have to discuss this toward
Please
the end of the
explain it
show.
to me,
We
yeah.
have to explain. There's a $12 billion state budget, $13 billion now, moving up to $15 billion
What's
at
a
the end of
billion
this
in
year.
either
What's a
direction?
billion?
Right, that's right.
Yes. And by the time you decide how that money is spent, you'll have spent all of it. Within that framework, we thought some of it should, and still think, Matt, that some of it should be spent to clean up hazardous waste, because that seems to be a priority on any intelligent person's mind. However, the question right now is, will the new tax that increases the taxes, which are already the 6th highest in the country in Massachusetts, this increases
Not
the tax
true, but
burden,
it's okay.
actually do a job that they haven't been able or willing to do with the $13 billion, heading up to $15
So what's
billion
your question?
that they have. My question is, since we're on the theme of jobs, if this were to pass, Bob,
Yep.
how would this affect jobs in Massachusetts?
Well, it would affect jobs in 2 ways. It would drive up the cost of doing business here. The pass-through on electricity, the costs for oil to heat buildings, whether they're private buildings or public buildings, in fact, hospitals and schools and so forth, would be a cost to businesses, and make it more costly to do business here. The other way it affects business is these are raw materials. I mean, this is not something very exotic stuff. I mean, the oils, lubricating fuels, lubricating oils for manufacturing. This is fundamental materials needed for our economy. And if a company in Massachusetts is faced with a higher cost and his competitor in Ohio is not, seems to me it's pretty easy. What happens is that the Ohio guy is able to bid lower on the cost, and the Massachusetts fellow has to either cut down on the number of employees he has here or she has here, or go out of business, or in some cases, since factories in Massachusetts are owned by national corporations, move those factories.
Bob, can I say one thing before Matt responds? That one of the things I never understand, though, is that your position is this thing alone, if it passes, is going to be the thing that breaks business.
No, I don't believe that,
But
Jim.
let me
What
just-
I
you
do
do this
believe
here-
is I believe this and other things are a corrosive effect on the economy of Massachusetts, especially this one, because this is unnecessary. But with
But is it natural extension?
400,000 jobs lost in this state in the last 3 years, and 220,000 of those being manufacturing, Massachusetts can ill afford to put a tax on the raw materials that sustain our economy and our
Then
society.
let me just ask you one question before we get to Matt's response. Then is the natural extension of that notion is that if we sort of serially repealed all taxes on business, that this would be a better business
No,
climate?
don't, you take things to extreme.
I feel like
That's-
it's tonight. I feel it's a Sunday night, it's cold out, and I can do that.
I think what we're really talking about is question 4, which is a very specific tax, which I believe is unnecessary to begin with, and which strikes at the heart of materials and the cost of
Gotcha.
doing business here.
Matt, how about the strange bedfellow thing that Barbara talked about before? AFL-CIO, Associated Industries of Massachusetts, most business business groups, chambers of commerce, and Barbara Anderson in this weird...
And the League of Women Voters.
If they all think it's going to cost jobs, why are you right in saying...
And I would add into that the largest chemical companies in the country. That's, in fact, who's bankrolling the whole campaign. They've gotten about $750,000 from the Dows and DuPonts and Monsantos and W.R. Grace. I just want to add that. And,
Fortunately, Citizens for Limited Taxation couldn't afford to fight this battle.
I mean, I guess I just want to go back to really what we're talking about. We're talking about a fifth of a penny per pound. A fifth of a penny per pound, which is going to raise about $25 million, which if you go back to we were talking about before, the size of the Massachusetts budget, which is $13 billion or $15 billion, it's
Massachusetts is a state. We're talking about companies paying their share.
So we're talking about the economy of Massachusetts, which is up in the hundreds of billions of dollars. We're talking about a very small tax, which is going to have a great effect on cleaning up toxic waste sites because...
Go ahead, no. So your basic point is there'll be some impact on jobs, but minimal.
There may be. They don't come up with any figures, which I had expected them to come up with these great, grandiose figures that it's going to cost thousands of jobs, and they haven't done that. And I guess I just want to turn it back on the costs that we're paying right now for toxic contamination. Last week I was talking to the selectman of Bedford. It's a town of about 4,000 people who's had 87% of its drinking water contaminated by the Hanscom Air Force Base and Raytheon Company. They have to pay $800,000 a year for drinking water bought from the town next door. They've paid $2 million, spent $2 million on a lawsuit to recover costs. They're looking into hooking up to MWRA, and the initiation fee of that is $5.8 million. And this is for a town of 4,000 families. So if you want to talk about the cost, I mean, and that's not even talking about...
This raise our MWRA costs?
This tax
If Bedford has lost 87% of its drinking water, what is it going to do? It's going to have to hook up to MWRA. And the initiation fee is $5.7 million on the citizens of Bedford who did nothing to contaminate their drinking water.
Doesn't the MWRA use some of these chemicals in...
Yes.
Are they going to have to pay this tax?
Yes, they will. If they buy the chemicals in-state, they will have to pay this tax.
So our MWRA costs, which are already out of control, will actually go up higher because of question 4?
Let's return to the phones for a second, see what they think about it. I should say, and from Boston. And also, if there's someone from Bedford or Holliston out there that Matt's been talking about, we'd love to hear from you. But first, Ann from Boston, you're with us on Talking New England. Welcome.
Hi. I was just curious if this law had been tried in any other states, and if so, what the result was.
Before he answers, we have a question you have to answer. Have you made up your mind on question 4 yet?
I think I'm leaning towards yes,
Okay.
because it just seems to make sense that, this problem has got to get cleaned up, and it doesn't seem like there's any real harm towards adding this tax. I think the job thing you're just talking about, won't there be jobs created by the companies who are going to start cleaning up some sites?
What's the answer?
Good
Other
question.
states and
That's a good
jobs
point.
created.
I mean, that's a good point.
Start with the other states, though. It was an interesting question.
Washington State actually has this tax. It raises about $70 million a year to pay both for state programs and for local programs, and it's worked. It was actually passed on the ballot in 1988 out in Washington, so it's worked successfully there.
How about the issue she raised about
I
create more
think
jobs?
that's another issue. That's another side benefit of this. It will actually get us out there working, cleaning up these dump sites. I should say a study using Department of Environmental Protection numbers showed that of the 5,000 sites out there, only 3% of them were actually in the cleanup phase for cleaning them up. The other 97% were still sitting there or still in the investigation phase.
Bob,
This will get us over.
is Washington
does this
State
create
working?
jobs?
Sorry, both questions. Washington State, is it working? And 2, what about the creation
Short
of
answer
jobs?
is, all I know is that Washington State does have a tax that bears some marginal resemblance to this one. They have a whole different tax scheme out there having to do with the tax on inventory, essentially, which is unlike anything Massachusetts has. In fact, the Department of Revenue in Massachusetts, in a letter to the Natural Resources Committee, threw up its hands as to how to administer this. Our data suggests that in order to administer this tax, it could cost anywhere between 3 and 10% of the actual tax generated just to collect it, which is against maybe 1%, which is what the...
How about jobs creation like Ann
really
asked?
interests me, what she said makes...
The implication here is that these sites, A, have not been addressed at all, and B, that this tax is going to be the end-all and be-all of cleaning up these sites, and both of those are factually wrong. The fact is that sites in Massachusetts are moving through a very elaborate system. I might add, a system that was put in place by the referendum in 1986. That was one of the things that straitjacketed this system.
Did you vote for the referendum in 1986?
No, I did not.
Okay.
Because the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, both on the House side and the Senate side, urged that this be rejected because of how complex it would ultimately get and how DEP's attention to priority sites would be fragmented over the landscape of all these inconsequential sites, and that's precisely what has happened.
Deborah from Lexington, you're with us next on Talk of New England. Welcome.
Hi.
You made up your mind?
Yes, I'm voting no on question 4.
You're voting no. Barbara, did you write that down?
Yes, I did.
Very well.
2 and 2
My
right now.
question was for Matt.
Sure.
I like what Barbara said about making polluters pay, because the one thing that bothers me about this question is Matt, if you really wanted to make polluters pay, wouldn't this tax also be on gasoline? Because I had understood that most of the abandoned sites were old gas stations.
What's the deal?
Well, we actually, under the Constitution, cannot tax gasoline because the revenues from that can only be used to build new highways. So that's what took us out.
What else isn't being taxed?
What about
Gasoline, home heating oil,
Why
which we
isn't
didn't
that
want to
being
tax
taxed?
because
Because
there's
then
a lot
you
of
lose on question 4.
No, there's a lot of
The person
low-income
who-
people who rely on home heating oil to keep themselves warm in the winter.
You've never made a strategic decision before on a ballot question, have you?
But I think
The
to
gasoline.
point out if somebody else is doing
The
it,
gasoline-
I'm not on the ballot right now.
The gasoline, under the Constitution, we can't do that, and we don't want to go against the Massachusetts Constitution. But agreeably, there's a bunch of gas stations out there that are toxic sites, which are along with a lot of other sites, sitting there, and we need to get the resources to get them.
Well, that's
cleaned
why
up.
that's why this question is misleading. If the theory of this is that here's the materials and here are these sites and there's some connection, which I don't believe there is, gasoline is exempt. Home heating oil, where there's a large number of sites that are home heating oil sites, is not taxed at all. I mean, that's just there's no connection.
So
It's
should we-
unfair.
do you want
It's
to
bad
tax
tax policy. Well,
Should we break
it's your
the Constitution
theory.
to tax the gas?
Oh, there are ways. You know as well as I do that a tax on the material gasoline is in fact prohibited for any purpose other than highways.
so we couldn't do it.
But there's a lot of ways you could have done it, Matt. But you chose not to. Your campaign chose not to in order to avoid any direct impact of this tax on the voters.
but
And in
here's
fact, you're
another-
going to see it indirectly in electric costs. You're going to see it indirectly in the costs to businesses.
Bob, let's
for
stop on
home
the cost for a second. I've been
for
trying to read
heating.
your notes, but unfortunately you scribble, so I can't really, would have been a great advantage to me. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that these other sources that you're talking about, these new sources through the amendments in the legislature, don't add up to the amount of money that DEP, as we've been calling it, says they need to fix this thing. And what would you then do? What's your position then if people don't vote for this thing? There's not enough money through these other avenues, and then we're $10, $20 million short from what even the government agencies themselves say they need to clean up this stuff. What do you do with it? Where do you find the money?
Again, I dispute with both you and Mr. Wilson.
I don't know what the number is. I'm just saying, I don't know.
The system that was approved in July of this year is a way to prioritize sites, to get out the bad sites that Matt was talking about, to get rid of the inconsequential sites, to get all of that clutter out of the way, to really focus on cleanups and not to engage in
Well,
some.
what
let
about
me
the
answer-
abandoned sites? There's no...
Here's the
abandoned
response,
sites.
and let's see how you all feel about it, including you, Jim. We have a state budget that's going up $1 billion to $1.5 billion this year alone. Do you think that this is an important enough question that some of the money that is already in the state budget, which is our state spending is still, and the tax is the 6th highest in the country, do you think this is an important enough issue that some of the $1.5 billion of increased spending this year should be spent on this subject without a tax increase, whether or not there's a tax increase? Is it enough of a priority?
For us, it's much preferable for it to come from the source. We think it makes sense to come from the source of toxic chemicals and industrial petroleum. The problem has been, over the past 4 or 5 years, we've been trying to get money any way possible, and it hasn't happened.
But here's
We can't
another
rely on the
question, Matt.
general
Wait, you're
fund.
talking about Dow chemical and toxic.
Wait a minute.
Isn't it true that those chemicals are things that we as consumers
Use all the time.
for things that are essential to our lives? And you act as if it's an evil thing that they, the
Because look what
polluters
it's done to the
incorporated, and they only
communities.
make the chemicals in order to pollute the groundwater. But
Well,
the
look what
fact
it's
is,
done.
We get up
they're
at 9
making
o'clock every
things-
morning to pollute the
Tell
environment.
me what
That's
some
not
of
true,
these
Matt.
things are actually used for that we as consumers rely upon.
Zinc would be taxed, for example, and zinc is used to galvanize metals, which are used along the highways as traffic barriers.
Zinc ointment that goes in the
No, I
lifeguard's
don't know
nose,
about
not
that,
that
but
kind
the
of zinc?
zinc that coats metals to avoid corrosion. The fact of the matter is that this tax generates only about 8% of its revenue from chemicals. All the rest comes from fuel oils, number 4 fuel oil and number 6 fuel oil.
But look at the devastation that the misuse of these materials have caused to our society.
And this tax,
104
tax is imposed on those companies who are absolutely doing the right thing.
Oh, like
And with the-
W.R.
and with the
Gray's, who's
50,000
contaminated water
and with the
supplies, and
50,000
Monsanto.
and with the 50,000 pound threshold, smaller companies that may do the wrong thing won't pay any tax at all. There's no fairness in that one, Matt.
We're going to be back in a little while. I should say, in the minutes or seconds remaining before we come back, we don't rank 6th in tax burden, at least according to my standards. We rank about 43rd. We'll describe the difference to you
Sixth
later.
per capita.
43rd based on income.
Enough to clean up hazardous waste sites if they really want to.
43rd, come back in 2 minutes. Thanks.
Sixth, and be sure to come. Welcome back to the Talk of New England. I'm Barbara Anderson. This is Jim Braude, and these are our guests. And we are discussing question 4 on the ballot.
Was there a long pause because you forgot who they were? Is that what it was?
You always do this. Well, you make me
Bob
be the one to
Braude,
remember.
no on 4.
That's
Matt Wilson,
right.
yes on
It
4.
was
You
Wilson.
don't need the names. Fair enough?
I keep wanting to call him Matt Storin.
Whoever. From the
Yes.
Globe, we know that. Denise from Boston, you're with us on Talk of New England. Welcome.
My question is, why are the residents of Bedford going to be responsible for paying for the pollution problems of their water supply when they're caused by Raytheon and Hanscom Air Force Base? I mean, why are not they responsible, and why are you even talking about taxing?
Before Matt answers that question, Denise, have you decided how you're going to vote on question 4?
Yes, I am.
And what's that wasn't like the old joke about, do you have the time? Yeah, I do. Well, and how is that? How are you going to vote, Denise?
Well, I don't think that we should be taxing on it. I think we should be going after people like Raytheon and Hanscom Air Force Base.
So you're a yes? You're a
Right.
no?
You're yes,
You're
no
yes.
new tax.
Fine, okay. Matt, what's the answer to the question? Why aren't we going after Raytheon and whoever else you said polluted that?
We are. In fact, Bedford spent $2 million in a process of suing them to recover the costs. They still haven't won yet. I use Bedford as an example as the cost that average citizens are paying every day for toxic contamination. They're paying to buy drinking water from the neighboring town. They're paying, they literally had to do a 2.5 override to raise more money to sue Raytheon. They had, and now they may have to hook into MWRA.
But is there any other vehicle, can I say, I actually hadn't thought of this until Denise asked the question. Is there any vehicle in place other than costly litigation if you know who is polluting, let's say your water supply, rather than having to do anything else? Is there some vehicle to go after a Raytheon?
Yeah, they went after WR Grace. You mentioned
have to spend a lot.
Yeah,
I use
right.
Bedford as an example because
What do you do besides sue them? What can you do?
to recover costs, you have to sue them.
Okay.
I use Bedford as an example of we can't have any more Bedfords across our state. The reason that the water's contaminated is because there's these toxic sites that have been sitting there.
This tax does nothing. This tax does nothing.
I want to hear the answer to my question, Matt. Wait a second. If you know who the polluter is, forget the name of the company for the moment. They're identified. Let's assume they even admit it. Is there some vehicle for the state now to go after that entity to force them to pay these costs?
To pay the cost for contaminated. Oh, they'll pay the cost for the cleanup. I'm just saying the delays in the cleanup, we've known about that site for years, and the site hasn't been cleaned up, and the result is contaminated water. We don't want any more Bedfords across the state by these toxic sites sitting around, and eventually they're going to contaminate our drinking water, and we shouldn't have these towns that are left with no drinking water supplies, paying out of hard, working families to have to pay for drinking water.
Bob, your blood pressure seems like it's rising. What's the deal?
There are responsible parties at 9 out of every 10 sites in Massachusetts. On average,
What does that mean? Can you tell me? What is
the party responsible for the
Oh, I'm
cleanup.
sorry, I'm sorry.
The party responsible for the cleanup. And the state statute, the 21E statute, requires that
Superfund
party,
Act.
that Superfund law, requires that party to come forward and mitigate, clean up the site and take care of any problems that may have occurred off-site. So those parties are there. They're spending a lot of money to clean up those sites, as well they should.
But one of the problems is the state does not have the money to enforce the program. Of the 500 priority
No,
sites,
they don't have the money
500
to-
of the priority sites, a third of them do not even have a staff person overseeing the
didn't-
cleanup
right.
to enforce it and to make sure it's happening. And that's why we're in the position that we're in.
No, and they didn't have that under the old straitjacketed system. They will have more money for these sites under the new program. They will have the ability to reallocate their personnel to go after the priority sites. This problem has been taken care of by this reform measure in July of this year. This is just a tax, Matt.
Back to the phones,
Let's
one
see
second.
what John from Salem says.
That's right. John, hi, how are you?
Hi.
How you voting? Do you know yet?
What I'm against all your taxes, and even on...
What do you mean, all
my
my taxes? You talking to me?
They're usually your taxes.
Go ahead, John. Why are you against this one? Yeah.
Because if I own a chemical company, and I'm polluting, and you say to me, you're going to pay a tax. I'll gladly pay the tax, 15, 20 cents, whatever you're going to stick on a gallon. But who's going to pay for it? I just pass it down to the guy on the bottom of the ladder. And the bottom of the ladder is the poor working man. Every place he goes, we're going to put a tax. Hey, if you're one rung on the ladder, you don't pay. If you're the bottom man, you pick up the whole tab. Why don't we go in, eliminate the general fund in the State House, and use that for pollution?
That's what Barbara said. John, you also raised in the middle of that a terrific question about, Matt, is this cheap enough? Let's assume that people think it's a good idea like you do, but what John seems to be saying is it's almost, okay, it's a cost of doing business. I'll pollute, I don't care, I'll pay this tax if it passes, and then I'll just pass it on to people down the line who use this stuff. Is John's point well taken?
Well, companies may or may not do that. You have to remember, again, we're talking about 1/5 of a penny per pound. It's a very small amount, which is going to have a large impact on toxic waste cleanup. And I guess it comes down to this bottom line of going, the toxics problem has just grown enormously. It's increased 13 times, and the resources that we're putting into it, it's just not nearly kept pace. We need resources, plain and simple, to enforce this program to clean up abandoned sites. We say tax toxic chemicals and industrial petroleum to pay for the cleanup of toxic chemicals and industrial petroleum. The other side says nothing. They hint at, well, it should come out of our general tax money. We don't think that's right. It should come from these companies that are using.
Let's get back to your numbers for a second. You said, was it 1/5 of a penny per pound? What does that mean? Pick the biggest. I read in one of your literature. What is it? Boston Edison would be the largest payer of this tax. Right. What would it mean in a typical, electric bill? What would the typical bill mean if question 4
And
was
Boston
passed?
Edison, these are the nasty old polluters we're talking about, right?
Yes, they are nasty polluters.
So how much are we talking about for the average family?
They estimate that it would be a $6 million tab that they would have to pay.
And how does that break down for the average family?
That would come out to about 0.5% increase if they pass it through, which for the 0.5% of the rate.
How much is that a month?
25 cents a month, which you have to keep in mind, they just approved a 10%. They asked for an 18% rate increase over the past year. It just puts it in perspective, the amount that this tax is very small. For the average ratepayer, if they in fact pass it through, 25 cents a month for a cleaner environment and clean water.
Well, there's no, 25 cents a month. I don't know if that's right or not. All I know is that $17 million is the cost that will be passed on to consumers, whether they're individuals or businesses. And there is no guarantee that any of this money is going to be used for this purpose. I think people are going to be outraged no matter how small or how large their income
Tony
is
from Peabody, are you outraged? How do you feel?
How you doing? I'm going to vote against it. In fact, I'm voting no on all 4 questions.
I thought you were going to say you're going to vote no 4 times on question 4. Is that what I thought you were going?
4 times on question 4.
I got you. You only count once on the show. Nice.
I kind of believe, Barbara Anderson, number 1, that we are the 6th highest tax-paying state.
You say you do or don't believe?
I do believe it.
Well, I'm going to explain to you why she's wrong in the next segment.
Let me ask my question and you can answer on television.
Yeah.
My question is, how do we know as a citizen that if this proposal should pass, that the money that is taken in the tax pays for that particular project? We have a bad history of taking money in taxes and not winding up where it's supposed to go.
Straightforward question. What's your answer, Matt?
As I said, when you go into the voting booth, it will be very clear to you that the money raised from this will go into the Environmental Challenge Fund, which under state law has to be spent on toxic waste cleanup. The legislature does have to make that appropriation, but you have to understand that people who are running this campaign, a lot of local grassroots people from Peabody, people all across the state who are living next to toxic waste sites and who are frustrated at the pace of cleanup. If this money isn't being spent, you can imagine who's going to be up there at the State House. Some local people are very angry, plus the 2 million voters.
Tony, you still
They are up there
I'm
now.
trying to get the 15 billion spent.
Tony, let me ask you a question. If all 200 members of the legislature raised their right hand and said to you, Tony from Peabody, I promise you I'm going to spend this the way this ballot question says it should be spent. Bill Weld signed on as well. Would you vote for it then?
No, I wouldn't, because I am the epitome of a cynic. I just don't trust those guys up there.
You're not
I wouldn't
a cynic.
trust them if the Lord was standing next to them and they raise their hand.
The Lord has not been elected to the Massachusetts legislature, at least maybe in the 92. We'll have to check back with you. Tony, thanks for calling. Peter from Saugus, you're with us on Talking New England. Welcome.
How you doing?
How you feel about question 4?
Absolutely voting for it.
You're voting for it.
All you have to do is drive down Lynn Marsh Road in Saugus and take a look at what the state has done to us over the years.
What's your question for these guests, Peter?
My question is, I agree with both of them in principle. They both want to see the problem resolved. And my feeling is similar to Matt's, that if the people lead, eventually the leaders will follow. I'd like to ask the gentleman that is working against question 4,
if he could provide a list showing the amount of money, where it's coming from the industries, and also show me where that money's going to in the legislature in terms of the people that he feels can do this job. Obviously, the people need a voice here. Question 4, as all referendum questions, allow the public to have a voice that hasn't been heard, that needs to be heard. The issue of resolving the tax, the money, where it's going to come from, come down to Saugus and take a look at the Dewey Daggett landfill site that the state has put its hands over its eyes about, and where people are fishing and...
Gotcha, Peter. That's a very good question. I'm only, because we're short on time, I want Bob to have a chance not only to answer it, but then make a 15 or 20-second summary, and then, Matt, you're going to get your chance.
Okay. The current fiscal 93 budget calls for about $12 million to be spent on the 21E program, the Superfund program, and there is a bond authorization for more money to be spent. The cost of those bonds are paid for by the transporter fee, so that's a private sector responsibility.
Why should they vote no?
About 30% or 40% of the $12 million is also paid by the private sector. They should vote no because this is just a tax. There's no guarantee that this money is going to be used for any purpose for cleanup. That
well said.
30
Matt,
seconds.
you get 10 seconds, then we got to go to a break.
We're urging people to vote yes on question 4 because we're facing a toxic waste crisis in Massachusetts. Yes, it's a tax, but it's a tax on the polluters and not us, the taxpayer.
Well, very brief on both of you. Bob Ruddock, Matt Wilson. Barbara didn't remember the names, so I had to say it.
I thought it was much clearer than it was before we started, and I hope people appreciate
Thanks for being with us. Come back at 6. We're going to discuss tax burdens. We're going to discuss jobs. We're going to have a quiz for you, a whole bunch of fun things, or at least sort of fun. See you in 2 minutes.
Welcome back to Talk New England. I'm Barbara Anderson. This is Jim Braude. I remembered your name. That's
Very
all
well
I had to
done.
do this segment.
She remembers their names too, but unfortunately they're gone now, so it really doesn't help very much. What are we going to talk about in this last half hour, Barbara?
Well, first of all, you have a treat for us.
Oh, I do indeed. Actually, we had a quiz segment a couple of weeks ago that was really a colossal success. Well, the problem is the first caller answered the question correctly, which really sort of blew it. But we've got another one for you this week. We're going to give you 3 names. And we want you to tell us what those 3 people have in common. Fair enough? I think that's fair. We're not going to tell you what the prize is because it's so exciting. We'd rather let it be a bit of a surprise. You have the first name. Who is it?
John Hagelin.
Okay, that's one. The second name is James Mac Warren.
And the third name is Howard Phillips.
Now, I want you to remember, all you got to do is tell us what those 3 people have in common. They are people, all 3 of them. Explain to us what they have in common, and you win a fantastic, is that true?
You didn't tell me anything about this prize.
Well, you may not win a prize, but anyway, you get the question right. Please do that.
Just like question 4, polluters pay, right.
Jobs. Yes. Let's talk about the 3 candidates. We first have Ross Perot, who seems to be saying, 1, the most important thing I've got to do to create a healthy economy and put people back to work, and there are a lot of little things he's saying, is to extinguish this deficit. He talks about how horrible the North American Free Trade Agreement is, all these other things. He wants to invest more money, maybe raise some taxes, but deficit is number 1.
And that's definitely a good point because the deficit is what's holding back the capital that you need to start getting the business
access to markets, right? I mean, access to credit and those sort of things. On to Bill Clinton. I know your favorite candidate. What's he saying as to how he's going to put people back to work? He's going to raise taxes and invest in jobs. Infrastructure. Put people, the sort of FDR notion that if you invest in infrastructure, what that basically means is put people back to work building things, fixing roads, building bridges, building buildings. He's going to pave over West Virginia? I don't know if that's what Arkansas is. That would create a lot of jobs to pave over. But in addition to that, he's also talking about requiring employers to spend roughly, I think it's 1 to 1.5% of their total payroll on job retraining so that the whole workforce has the chance for new jobs as the service sector begins to kick in even more dramatically. And then there's George Bush, who has a fabulous plan for the economy. Do you want to describe it and how to put people back to work? You can say we're only, 29 million short on the 30 million promise he made. The good thing about Bush's plan is that it's not Clinton's plan, because Clinton's plan is to raise taxes, to spend on government. Well, that's the problem. The problem is we're not talking just about George Bush. We're talking about Bill Clinton and his plan to put people back to work by taking money from the productive sector and putting it into the public sector. I'll try again. Let me try one more time. George Bush's plan to put people back to work is what? is what, let me just tell you, one of the most amusing times I had on March 15th, I think was that the presidential primary, March 15th? Leading up to March 15th,
long ago.
I would hear a lot of radio commercials as I was driving around the state. And my favorite one was Bill Weld, the governor of Massachusetts, with patriotic music playing in the background. He said, I'm Bill Weld, I'm joining Joe Malone, Paul Cellucci, all these people, to tell you to vote for George Bush. And here's why you should vote for George Bush, because he's best for the economy. And you know what he proceeded to do? And I thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. He proceeded to list 4 tax breaks. A cut in the capital gains tax, an investment tax credit, 4 tax breaks that was all that George Bush stood for to allegedly revitalize the economy. I said to myself, crazy me, isn't that what we already tried? There was a disaster, nothing about investment, nothing about education, nothing about retraining.
Before you
because there's
rattle on here,
nothing.
first of all, they didn't cut the capital gains tax. That's the point. They increased the capital gains tax, which is why we've had a job loss, which is another reason our recession has lasted so long.
It was 1986.
So George Bush's plan, if you want to talk about his plan, is to cut the capital gains tax. Why he didn't just go ahead and index it to inflation when he could have done that by himself, I don't know. It's very hard to defend George Bush. However, the issue here is one of our callers brought up, which is if you're going, they were talking about jobs, and the against question for side was saying this would cost jobs because it would increase the cost of doing business, and the other side was saying in response to the call that it'll actually create jobs in cleaning up the hazardous waste fund. And this is the point that we have to discuss here, Jim, because the fact is any job creation in the public sector comes from the private sector. There is no money in the public sector. So it is the private sector that creates the jobs, that create the revenue for all jobs and all services. So any money that's spent on Superfund or anything else,
no public investment.
All of that comes, but you have to understand something. The money you spend on public investment, whether it's roads or bridges or cleaning up hazardous waste sites or anything else you do, first has to come from the private sector. So you don't create any money. That's right. You don't create any money. You don't add to the total amount of money available. All you do is take it from the private sector. So while the things that government does in many cases may be worth doing, creating jobs, it's a wash, because the money that I would spend my tax dollars, what I would spend my tax dollars on, goes to creating a job over here. If you take it from me and spend it on the public sector, it may create a job there.
This is the centerpiece,
but it isn't going to increase the number of jobs available.
If it's the centerpiece of the campaign, which clearly the economy is, then why, if it turns out that you're right, and you seem to be pretty passionate about it, why is it that more people support Bill Clinton, who says, yes, I'm going to raise taxes, although only in the rich and foreign corporations, Ross Perot, 20% today, at least in the poll I saw, who says, I'm going to raise the gasoline tax by 50 cents, invest that money in deficit reduction and building bridges and those sort of things. Between them, they have more than 60% of the vote. If the free market is the solution, then why is nobody buying it?
I'm not quite sure why people are voting for Bill Clinton, but I don't think it has anything to do with the free market. Let's ask Bill from Quincy who he's going to vote for, and
how do you create jobs, Bill? But equally importantly, do you have the answer to our quiz?
No, I just tuned in 5 minutes ago, but I was thinking that the answer to the question you just asked is called being hoodwinked, like you hoodwinked people on question 3 2 years ago.
Who are you talking to?
You, Jim.
Me. Question 3, if you don't recall.
I remember.
I should say, Bill, wait. Let's just tell the callers. Let's just tell people what question 3 was. It was a CLT tax rollback that my organization, with the help of roughly 1,200,000 people, defeated. Yes, Bill.
You just threw out this 6% figure, but that's not what it calls about. You know, I wanted to call about, you asked Barbara about what jobs was President Bush going to create.
Right.
But I wanted to talk about really Bill Clinton's jobs.
Sure.
You know, the 1.5% tax on industry.
Yes, exactly.
For retraining, like this, retrain to what? To retrain them to be nurses, aides, work at McDonald's. You know, jobs that people won't take already.
You're talking about the payroll
lawyers, doctors, but minimum wage jobs. And they're going to take, they're going to put a bigger burden on industry and cause more layoffs with these taxes. I mean, this is just a vicious cycle of.
So, Bill, let's assume it is a payroll tax.
Right.
Bill, let's assume for the moment that you're right and Clinton's plan is a rotten idea. I assume you're voting for Bush. What's the good idea that Bush has to rejuvenate the economy after this 4 years of abysmal failure? What's he going to do that's going to put people back to work?
Smaller government.
Smaller government.
At least smaller than Bill Clinton's government. I mean, granted, under George Bush, the government has grown. It's now 25% of GNP, and we had it down to 22% under Reagan, up from 24% under Carter.
Barbara, you aware
which
of the
is why
fact,
a lot of us aren't wildly enthusiastic about George Bush. But what Bill is saying is, at least it won't grow under Bush as fast and as far as it's going to grow under Clinton.
One of the wonderful ironies, Bill, about these big spending Democrats, as everybody calls them, do you know that this year George Bush's budget was larger than what he got back from that horrible Democratic
But it
Congress?
wasn't big enough for you, was it, Jim?
Maybe not. Bill, thanks for being with us. Brett from North Carolina, welcome to Talking New England, or at least talk of the East
This
Coast.
is our farthest away.
No, we had one
caller.
from, well, whatever. But welcome anyway, Brett. Nice to have you.
Hello, Brett?
Brett?
Hello?
Did I say something? Hi,
Yes,
Brett. How are you?
Okay, here's my comment. I'm a businessman. I've owned my own business for 13 years.
What kind of business?
I have a restaurant. I'm down in Pinehurst. The problem is not the big government with the jobs. I can't find anybody working. Neither can any of the other people around here. You know, all the employers around here. There's just nobody out there who wants to come and work.
What's the unemployment
they
rate?
They complain about wage, and then they come in and they don't even want to try to work. They just want to lay around. They don't want to come in to work. And this has been an ongoing thing for 12 years. And I know a lot of other business people. I'm in the chambers and all the local things in the state. And everybody says the same thing. People do not want to work.
Brett, what's the unemployment rate in your part of North Carolina?
Excuse me?
What's the unemployment rate in your part
To
of
tell you the
North
truth, I really don't know.
But you're saying basically
You're
you put
saying
an
you're
ad in the
having a hard
newspaper
time getting-
and no one wants to work.
I'm not just talking about North Carolina. I travel throughout the U.S., okay? I have friends all over the country, other business friends. And everybody says the same thing. People just don't want to work.
All right, then tell us this, Brett. How do they live if they aren't working?
Yeah, I don't know. They're living off of, I don't know, maybe all the government programs that everybody's getting paid
Brett,
out.
with all due respect,
there's a huge number of people around here.
Well, no, wait a minute. We know this was true because in Massachusetts, during the boom periods, our employers were having a very hard time finding people to work.
That's why when you turn on the 6 o'clock news, that's why you turn
there were people
on
on
the...
welfare who were refusing to take these jobs because our welfare
Oh, I'm
benefits
sorry, I
were
missed
so
this. This
high.
is the time to bash welfare recipients.
I'm not bashing welfare. Okay, I'm not bashing welfare or anything like that.
That was one issue.
Wait, Brett. When you turn on the 6 o'clock news, there is rarely a night when you don't see an ad that went in the newspaper for 1 job, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, where 500 people didn't line up at 6 o'clock in the morning to get there. People are crying out for jobs.
Let me tell you something,
Sure.
okay? I've got jobs right now where I can pay cooks, great money. I mean, just good money.
What's great money, by the way?
I can pay
What
them
difference
8
does
or
it
9
make your
bucks.
job?
I can be at $8 or $9 an hour, right? And you know what I get in here? I get people who are on lewds. They look like they're on lewds. They walk around in a daze.
Lewds means quaaludes for those of us who are not...
I don't understand. It's an ongoing thing. I could see if it was just something from this year or last year. But like I said, I am a successful businessman. I've been in for 12 years, and for 12 years it's been the same thing. People do not want to work.
Well, Brett, I would suggest if you open a restaurant in downtown Boston, you'd have so many people looking for those jobs.
Our restaurants are going out of business in downtown Boston.
Hold it. Everybody says they're out there looking for jobs, and you see a little spot on TV. But what I'm saying is that little spot was planned and set up, and everybody heard there's big jobs coming in, sure. But I'll tell you what, there's a lot of little businesses out there, and we are the backbone of this country, and I bust my butt every day, do it 12, 14 hours a day, to make it work. And I got responsibility to my employees, and I'm out there doing it. But I'll tell you what, I don't know where the people are. I just have no idea. Everybody tells me there's a big unemployment problem.
We got you, Brett.
Well,
I've never
for one thing,
seen it.
they're on unemployment.
I've never seen it.
I mean, there is one place with the unemployment benefits being extended, one of the downsides for this is that they don't have an incentive to take a job that someone like Brett is offering because they can make as much money by being on unemployment. And that
Thoroughly untrue. And you think people prefer to be on unemployment? You think people prefer to be on unemployment for even an extended, limited period of time and have a real
Are you telling me
job?
that there aren't people out there who are not taking jobs like he is offering, even in Massachusetts?
Of course there's some people. You're like Ronald Reagan, Barbara. You pick one example, 2 examples, 3 examples, and you broaden it. The reality is people want to work.
Explain to me why he can't get someone to work as a cook
Come
in
to
his
my
restaurant.
unemployment center down the street from my house and you talk to them. You offer them a
find
job.
someone to work in his
Richard from
restaurant.
Watertown, welcome to Talking New England.
You were talking about what would stimulate the economy.
Yeah.
They had a Gallup poll and a CNN poll, and they were independent, and they turned out to have about the same results. 60% of the American people polled said that cutting taxes, cutting regulation would stimulate the economy.
So why aren't those 60% of the people supporting the candidate who supports that notion?
Number one is Bill Clinton has gotten the free ride in the media. He's out there saying things that are just factually ludicrous.
Like what?
Like what? Like saying that this is the worst economy in 50 years. The worst economy was under Jimmy Carter. We're right on the edge of a depression.
He has exaggerated. I agree.
If Reagan hadn't gotten in and cut taxes, it would have been, we could have slipped into a depression. Also, he's saying that we're slipping behind the rest of the world in manufacturing. That's a joke. We are the most efficient, competitive manufacturer. We dominate the world in aerospace, telecommunications, drugs, chemicals, and a whole bunch of other industries. We're on our way up. while Europe and Japan are on their way down. They're
But
going
you
to
should
be a
know,
lot
Richard,
deeper than we are.
you're living in a state now where in Massachusetts we've lost somewhere from 200 to 250,000 manufacturing jobs over the last handful of years. So maybe you might be talking about the rest of America, but you're surely not talking about Massachusetts.
Well, that's true, but who was the last governor except a liberal Democrat with basically the same program as Bill Clinton? All right, in my mind, there is a great vacuum as far as analysis on what caused the near depression in Massachusetts. About a year and a half ago, we would have had a 13 to 14% unemployment rate. And as far as I'm concerned, this is supply-side economics in reverse. 3 major tax hikes in 3 years pulled the plug on a strong, diverse economy.
But Richard, then why aren't we in great shape since Bill Weld, with the help from Barbara Anderson, led the charge to repeal several $100 million in taxes last year? Why aren't we in tremendous shape? Why isn't everybody back at work? Why isn't the economy booming?
It could have been a great deal worse.
I haven't done business in Massachusetts probably for 2 years. And until recently, about the last 4 months, I hadn't done any business in Massachusetts. I had to find markets in other states by mail. Okay? Just recently, the economy is beginning to come back. There are now jobs available, far more, not adequate. Okay? There are far more jobs than there were when Dukakis left office.
Richard, before we leave you, I have a question for you on a related note. No one has answered our quiz question. Do you have any idea who John Hagelin, James McWarren, and Howard Phillips are, what they have in common?
Howard Phillips is a conservative. I believe he's running for president.
Hey.
Who are the first two?
Howard Phillips, John Hagelin, and James McWarren.
The first two I do not recognize. I just assume they'd be running for president, some small party.
Unbelievable.
He won.
You win the prize. We don't know what it is. Stay tuned.
And
Thanks for calling,
furthermore, you're
talking
right
to
about
England.
everything you said, which is even more important.
I want to say before we go to break, some people we didn't talk about who are also running for president. Lyndon LaRouche from jail, who said, quote, "It's a terrible inconvenience to be running from jail." Jim Bourne on the Apathy Party ticket, who says, quote, "I will not steal the first 2 years of my administration."
And then-
These are the kind of guys you want to vote for, right?
No, I want to vote for Andrew, well, I'm not going to, but I'd like to vote for Andre Marou, who defines politics using the Greek word poly, many, ticks, blood-sucking parasites.
Gotcha.
Politics being many blood-sucking
The
parasites. I like
Libertarian
that,
candidate.
Mr. Marou.
Well, you'll have your chance, but she chose George Bush. Come back in 2 minutes. We'll talk more about jobs, more about elections,
Because I
more
have
about
to
question
stop Bill
4.
Clinton.
Gotcha.
It's the only
I don't think
way.
you're going to do it, though, Barbara.
Welcome back to Talk of New England. I'm Barbara Anderson. This is Jim Braude.
Thank you.
And I'm the one who's supposed to be keeping track of the poll, but once again, I don't think I did it exactly right. I have 4 no's. There were 4 definite no's. I have 3 definite yeses, but one of the people I was confused about because she said she didn't want to see the people in Bedford paying higher taxes to have to clean up their own local site, but she was against taxes, and I don't know if she was against us all paying higher, or businesses paying higher taxes on question 4, or all of us paying higher taxes if question 4 doesn't pass.
So it's just as scientific
So
as
I'm
I
not
said is the bottom
clear about
line.
that.
That's pretty much where
But
we
this
are.
is the bottom line of the problem, which is somehow you're going to have to pay to clean up these hazardous waste sites. And do you do it with existing $15 billion eventually in the state budget? Do you use that existing money? And my argument was that's what you should be doing because our tax burden is already the 6th highest per capita in the country, and therefore there should be plenty of money there to do essential things like cleaning up hazardous waste.
One of the reasons
or to
why-
tax business more and risk losing job loss, but soon as someone's going to have to pay for this.
One of the reasons I've always loved Barbara is because she's never let the facts
Do you
stand in the
always
way of a
love
good
her?
argument.
I didn't know he
I should
always
say to you, by the way, somebody wanted to know, John Hagelin is the candidate for the Natural Law Party. He's on the ballot in 27 states in the District of Columbia. Howard Phillips for the Taxpayers Party in 21 states. James McWarren, Socialist Workers Party in 13 states and the District of Columbia. But getting back to tax
Jim
burden.
loved his little games, but now tell us about the tax
I want to
burden.
say that guy, I believe Richard from Watertown, wanted to know what his surprise was.
Yes, and will you stop telling people
Lunch
the
with Barbara
surprise?
Anderson. She refused to do it, Richard. So call her at work tomorrow morning and see what you can work
Just
out.
like he's making up all the
Tax
stuff about
burdens.
taxes.
Virtually every economist, virtually every business group, as a matter of fact, looks at tax burden the following way. They don't total up the number of dollars of taxes and divide them by all the people, as Barbara does. They look at the percentage of income in a particular state, a percentage of a family's income that goes to all taxes and fees. Why is that a better measure? Because it reflects people's ability to pay. By that measure, we rank 43rd nationally, not 6th. But, and there's a big but before I get
That
interrupted.
includes fees.
That
That's
does-
not the
that's
tax
absolutely right.
burden.
That does not
That's the
mean...
revenue
we
burden,
agree on that.
including fees.
That does not mean, by the way, that we're undertaxed or underfeed. What it means is compared to other states, here's where we stand. The question it doesn't answer is how fair our tax system is or how unfair it is. That's a future show. Sammy of Portsmouth?
Wait a minute. The reason we use per capita is that
Because you want to deceive the public.
This shows how much you are actually spending on services.
But it doesn't show whether you're able to pay or not.
Man, woman, and child. Tell the people in Massachusetts they're able to pay more in the middle of this major recession.
Sammy from Portsmouth, you're with us on
Hi, Sammy.
Talking New England. You don't get to answer the quiz because someone beat you to it. Welcome.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
What do you want to talk about?
Well, I got a question for Barbara.
Sure.
She seems to think that Bill Clinton will create jobs, and
No, that's Jim.
I've yet to see any politician create jobs.
You're absolutely right. That's what I was saying.
No.
They don't create jobs. They take money from us and give it to the government because the private sector has already created jobs to give us money that they can take from us.
Sammy, I think you were talking about me, and to quote Bill Clinton the other night, he says, George Bush is a jobs destroyer, I'm a jobs creator. And I think Clinton has a fairly healthy mix, even though there's some flaws, of stimulating the private sector with the notion that the public sector has to try to jumpstart it with these building projects, those sort of things, tried and true. He also, ironically, believes in some of these tax breaks for business, some of these incentives in a targeted, limited way. He also believes the private sector has to be stimulated. He ironically believes with Barbara to a degree that that's where the bulk of the jobs come from, but he also says quite emphatically that this trickle-down garbage from Reagan to Bush, and hopefully only one term from Bush, simply doesn't work. All it does is make the rich richer. It doesn't create any jobs for anybody. It just creates bigger bank accounts for wealthy investors.
Sammy, elaborate on what you were saying.
I disagree with that simply because you can't have a politician decide and determine how jobs are created. You need a businessman in there.
So you're voting for Ross Perot?
I think it seems like the most logical choice at this point because, as we've seen over the past, I go back to Nixon, that neither party's been sufficient at creating jobs. It's been whether the world economy is up or whether the world economy is down. Right now, we're in a worldwide recession. We need somebody in there that has business experience, not politics as usual.
It's like a growing number of people, as we were discussing before the show, an exploding number of people seem to agree with you, and there's great movement towards Perot. But let me ask you, one piece of his package is a 50-cent per gallon tax increase on gas. Do you support it?
I support it over an extended period of time, yes, simply because I've been in Europe in business, and it's $4 a gallon over there. Try that one on.
Gotcha, Sammy. Thanks for calling Talking New
years,
England.
actually.
Maureen, you're with us next on Talking New England.
Hi.
Welcome. Hi.
How are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
Good, thanks. I just want to let you know that I do support Ross Perot. I think that Clinton and Bush are a perfect example of the continuation of our growing government. In the last debate, between the two of them, Clinton and Bush, there were over 200 advisors. They had motorcades between the two of them that reached 100 cars. Ross Perot had a cellular phone, 3 advisors, and a rent-a-car. I mean, they argued at the debate over partitions so that Bush and Clinton wouldn't have to see each other as they were approaching the stage.
Maureen, I think you make some good points, but in addition to those 3 advisors and a cellular phone, Ross Perot also has Admiral Stockdale, who seems to be an honorable person, but makes a lot of people nervous about being a heartbeat away. He doesn't cause you concerns? Do you see the vice president?
I did have concerns during the vice presidential debate, but I also saw him later in an interview, and I was very impressed.
I heard that interview was dynamite.
Have you been supporting Maureen?
I want to ask you a question. Maureen, okay, I certainly understand how you feel and what you're saying, but do you have, left with the other two, Bush and Clinton, do you have a favorite between the two? I mean, if they were the only ones in the race, is there one you prefer over the other?
Barbara never lets me ask a hypothetical. I can't believe she's doing this all of a sudden.
Well, I will answer that. If I had to choose between Bush and Clinton, I would choose Clinton, but very reluctantly. I would probably vote for Andre Moreau.
Okay, are you concerned, though, that your vote for Ross Perot guarantees that your third choice, your last choice, George Bush, might win? Assuming, of course, that
No, I could never consider a vote in a democracy for someone that I believed in as a waste.
Well put, Maureen.
Very good point.
Thanks for joining us.
My chance.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. Mike from Washington State, you're with us on Talking New England. How you doing?
Hello, this is Mike Struthers from Washington State. I'm a building contractor.
You have a hot Senate race or two out there, don't you?
This is the farthest away we've...
Hello?
You have a hot Senate race out in Washington too, don't you?
Yes, but the comment I wanted to make, I didn't want to waste your time,
No,
is
go right ahead.
the reason we're still in a recession is because of the capital gains tax that they took away from it.
Capital gains tax, you mean the deduction
the
they took
capital
away?
gains tax phased out, our economy went with it. And the economy was good before that.
Do you know, incidentally, do you know who
Jim
signed
doesn't understand what capital
the
is,
Democrats
so
are
it's-
loving it. The Democrats love it because it's letting them have a shot at the White House.
Mike, do you know, by the way, who it was that signed the capital gains tax deduction away? Who let it be repealed? Do you know what president that was?
That is immaterial because
Ronald
it was
Reagan.
negotiated by a bipartisan group of two men that were making up this tax overhaul, which one of them was a Democrat.
Do you think Ronald Reagan was asleep when he was signing?
Unfortunately, they pulled the wool on Ronald Reagan. And
Which
this
isn't that
is what
hard to
we
do.
wound up with.
Gotcha.
That's irrelevant, but the fact is, Mike is pointing something out.
And
That the
as soon
cut
as
in the
it-
capital gains tax would stimulate the economy, and they know it, but they aren't doing it. And with the impression you were giving us, Mike, is that you think that the Democrats deliberately are hoping that the recession will continue just long enough to get them reelected?
Do you believe that?
You know, I actually do. I hate to say that I'm that cynical, but I think
One word.
the party out of power always
Ludicrous. Jim
hopes
from
that things will be
Marlboro.
bad so that they can get into power.
Quick call from
That's what's
Jim.
wrong with our system.
Marlboro. How are you? Welcome.
Hi, how you doing?
We got it quick, please.
All I'd like to say is I was watching CNN today, and I was listening to Clinton campaign or whatever, and he basically realigned what he thought middle class was. The gentleman asked him, what does Bill Clinton consider middle class? And Bill Clinton's gentleman there said 50,000 above is
Oh, no, wait a minute. He
above
said
middle class.
200,000 and below, he said, was middle class before.
Well, Jim,
He
what
was
Jim's
only
saying
gonna
is he said
tax people.
50,000 today. That's
Well, what
why
does
Bill
that
Clinton is
say
glad
about
the
Bill
election's in
Clinton?
only 9 days, I should say. He actually said 50,000 and above.
50,000 above is the cutoff from middle class. So 50,000 and below is middle class.
Let me tell you something, Jim.
51,000 is the rich.
Jim, if he actually said that, he's in big trouble, bigger trouble than he seems to be in this morning's polls. That won't wash with the American people.
And I just see
Jim,
him
thanks.
say-
Wait a minute.
And the guy said, because the guy asked him specifically, because Clinton's so vague on what he considers middle class, that the guy asked him, well, what are you going to do about taxes? And all you get from Clinton's campaign is, we don't know what we're going to do in an emergency situation.
But we know what
If
we're going
that
to do.
isn't
Jim, we got to go.
vague,
Thanks
I
for
don't know what it
calling.
is.
Call again next week. Barbara, only a few seconds ago, what are we doing next week?
Next week, we are going to focus on the Massachusetts campaign, particularly the necessity to sustain the governor's veto by electing senators who are working for the taxpayer.
And we're going to spend a few minutes, though, more on presidential politics, since that seems to be exciting people. And if you can't do the counting, it's going to be 1-2 days before Election Day. We hope everybody's going to vote. We're going to tell you our preferences in congressional races, in state senate races. We're going to talk
And on
about
these ballot questions.
all these
It'll be
kinds of
fun.
things. It's going to be pretty exciting. I'm anxious to see. Barbara Anderson actually supported that ballot question in 1986. She's actually supporting George Bush in 1992. It's frightening.
Reluctantly.
Read her lips. Please join us next week. Talking to England
50,000
Sunday night.
and up is rich.
Thanks for being with us.
And you're supporting him?